with each new political catastrophe that we endure. Frederick Bastiat's warning about protectionism being the worst enemy and greatest threat to democracy is becoming factually evident and undeniably true. Just like any other illness or plague, the moral disease of protectionism is infectious and capable of mutating or adapting to gain strength and invade. In fact, protectionism has already spread from decade to decade because it can and will use any platform or issue as a medium to enthrone tyrants and disperse misery. By utilizing the principle of teaching by example and learning by experience, copycat tyrants and our two self-serving political parties, continually find new opportunities to enslave and steal from their fellow man. A direct line of connection and evidence of the vile contagion protectionism can be traced from the Vietnam War to the invasion of Iraq. The list of identical and illegal policies utilized by those in power make it self-evident that protectionism is now deeply embedded in our government and politics. The litany of unconstitutional and immoral actions taken by both Democratic and Republican presidents, decades apart, is as follows. Number one, both Presidents Johnson and Bush had tragic, preventable domestic catastrophes to cover up. The assassination of JFK was Johnson's albatross, and 9/11 was the scarlet letter for Bush. Two, while other ordinary citizens of their generation willingly sacrificed and served in the war of their lifetime, Johnson and Bush had cushy, sketchy, totally unremarkable military records. Both Johnson and Bush coveted and willingly sought the bragging rights that came with being a wartime president. Number three, to serve their own purposes, Presidents Johnson and Bush used misinformation and totally fabricated falsehoods about the necessity of war. The use of outright lies to manufacture a threat or create a crisis is the very first step in protectionism. Number four, both Presidents Johnson and Bush chose to invade much smaller countries, thousands of miles from the United States, that were of no imminent threat to us. The only criteria or justification was that they were inhabited by people of a different race and religion. This racial disparity made it much easier for Johnson and Bush to excuse and explain the casualties and deaths of young patriotic soldiers to the American public. Number five, the same Texas-based construction contractor or conglomerate with deep political ties to Johnson and Bush was the main beneficiary of no-bid contracts in both wars. Number six, conventional military tactics, weapons, and training were ineffective or useless in these protectionist wars, and even enabled or contributed to the high casualty rate for our brave soldiers. Number seven, the Vietnam War and Iraq invasion were political protectionist wars fought to cover up domestic failures, and military victory was never the objective. Number eight, Americans paid a heavy price in dollars and lives before each war ended in humiliating defeat and retreat. the only thing that was protected by decades of unnecessary death, painful sacrifice, and generations of grief were the corporate profits of military contractors and the political reputations or careers of greedy politicians. Protectionism does not solely depend upon war to spread misery, tyranny, and greed in a democratic or free society. In the decades since our country became infected with protectionism, this cancerous growth has developed the ability to mutate and is now metastasized in all our governmental branches and systems. In simple terms, Washington, D.C., and all the government apparatus located there are directed by the motto, cover up and carry on, and power is maintained through a code of malfeasance and turf wars. Cover up and carry on is the unspoken oath taken by every member of the political cartels, also known as the Democratic and Republican parties. The spending and budget of our government is unmanageable and out of control because the gears, levers, and pulleys that run our country are pulled by bureaucratic lifers who believe that their real duty is to protect the turf of their department or agency at all costs. There is no presidential action or decree that shouts out, cover up and carry on any louder than the unconditional pardon Gerald Ford issued to Richard Nixon. Protectionism could now be retroactive with the use of smoke and mirrors to distort the truth and deny justice. President Gerald Ford postulated and proclaimed that Americans were too weak and battered to endure the legal prosecution and public trial of a corrupt former president. Justice for those who abused power at the highest levels was considered too strong of a prescription or cure for a country that was sickened by tyranny and greed. The lame excuse Gerald Ford used was clown school illogical because any wounds or hurts that we needed to heal from were caused by Nixon and his corrupt administration in the first place. Once again, the United States and its citizens were being protected by a wise-sounding, weak-willed, lifetime politician with corrupt, evil, underlying motives. Common sense and unbiased investigation leads to the conclusion that Gerald Ford did not pardon Richard Nixon and absolve him of his crimes so that our nation could heal. In reality, President Ford brazenly used the powers of his office to cover up his own disloyalty and criminality. As a member of the Warren Commission, Representative Ford had participated in the cover-up of the murder of JFK and in so doing committed treasonous acts of his own. FBI files revealed that Representative Ford likely functioned as a mole, covertly passing privileged information about Warren Commission hearings along to J. Edgar Hoover. Wow. Gerald Ford knew that Nixon was capable of and willing to settle old scores by exposing the cover-up of the crime of the century. It is an amazing testament to the powers of protectionism that the pardon Ford granted has protected his reputation or legacy and whitewashed history to this day. Gerald Ford, a participant in the cover-up of the murder of JFK, now has the largest warship ever built, stained with his name. While Cover Up and Carry On grabs all the attention and headlines, another more subtle and insidious form of protectionism does the real dirty work on a day-to-day basis in Washington. Everyone, from a cabinet-level secretary to a simple records clerk, knows the unwritten rule that governs all interactions in Washington. Anyone cashing a government check follows the mantra that no matter what the price, no matter how long it takes, no matter who gets hurt or even killed, one must protect the turf of their agency or department at all costs. The safety and well-being of the taxpayers who pay their salaries is not the number one priority or goal of agency bureaucrats, and the tragedy of 9/11 is proof. The first bombing of the World Trade Center on 2/26/93 set off a series of events that finally culminated in the attack and inferno of 9/11. After the first failed attempt to take down the Twin Towers, FBI agent John O'Neill became intensely focused on tracking down and capturing the terrorists who were responsible. His investigation led to valuable information and some arrests, but the trail went cold until the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen. After 7 years of tireless work, O'Neill's passion and intensity to bring America's enemies to justice did not sit well with his superiors because it reminded everyone that the case still wasn't closed. The bombing of the USS Cole brought the FBI and everybody else back to reality. O'Neill convinced his superiors of the connection between the two bombings and persuaded them to send him to Yemen to investigate. O'Neill's singular focus and dogged determination while in Yemen soon provided facts and results, but he also stepped on some toes while working to protect Americans. The American Embassy and State Department ambassador soon began to field complaints that Agent O'Neill was not being mindful of local customs, disrespected the turf of various factions, and did not consult or defer to local authorities. The truth is that Yemen's leaders were deceitful, corrupt, and had various links to numerous terrorist organizations. FBI agent O'Neill was discovering connections, proving that the bombing of the USS Cole and the first bombing of the World Trade Center were carried out by the same fanatical mastermind. Unfortunately, Agent O'Neill's steadfastness, honesty, and courage were not enough to overcome or neutralize the pettiness and insecurity of the United States ambassador. O'Neill was focused on information and results, but the ambassador stuck to the code of Washington and decided to protect their turf, even though that jurisdiction was backwater Yemen. The deployment to Yemen had been grueling, and progress was a hard fight, so O'Neill welcomed the opportunity to return home for the Thanksgiving holidays and some much-needed rest. While preparing to return to Yemen to resume the investigation, O'Neill was informed by his superiors that the State Department, acting upon the recommendation of the United States ambassador, had revoked his visa. O'Neill was now banned from returning to Yemen to continue the investigation and search for the terrorists. It is chilling and disheartening to realize that a criminal investigation into a terrorist bombing was interrupted and halted to soothe the ruffled feathers and whining of a career diplomat. Had FBI agent John O'Neill been allowed to return to Yemen and continue the investigation, it is quite possible and highly likely that 911 could have been prevented. Unfortunately, turf wars between government agencies is the norm in Washington, and protectionism continues to extract a precious price from all Americans. Our nation is $37 trillion in debt. The world is burning up, and our wildlife is being driven to extinction by plastics. The only thing that can help us or save us is the most powerful force in creation, the truth. Join the Free Hand for Truth Party and fight for the truth.